As I stood at the edge of love and fear, I never thought he'd be the one to teach me how to heal. I didn't trust anyone, least of all myself. But then, he appeared, and everything changed. Healing is never a straight line. It's messy, painful, and unpredictable. But in the end, it's worth it. Heartbreak isn't just an emotion. It's a storm, a violent, unrelenting force that tears through every part of your life. That's how it felt when my world came crashing down. I had given my heart to someone I trusted completely, someone I thought would hold it gently forever. But when that trust was broken, it didn't just leave cracks in my heart. It shattered the foundation of who I thought I was. After the betrayal, I wasn't just angry or sad. I was lost. The pain felt all-encompassing, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. Every attempt to move forward felt like dragging a boulder behind me. I told myself I'd never love again. It seemed safer that way. Why risk opening my heart when it could so easily be torn apart again? So I built walls. I surrounded myself with silence, turning away from the world. I stopped returning calls, skipped social events, and buried myself in distractions that kept me too busy to feel. I convinced myself that isolation was a kind of strength, a way to stay in control of my own pain. But deep down, I wasn't strong. I was terrified. Fear became my constant companion, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of trusting someone else, the fear of even trusting myself. I thought I was protecting myself, but in reality, I was only trapping myself in a cycle of doubt and loneliness. Yet life has a strange way of intervening when you least expect it. Just as I was settling into the idea of a guarded, loveless future, he appeared. At first, he was just another face, another stranger I could easily ignore. But there was something different about him, something I couldn't quite put into words. He didn't try to rush into my life or break through my walls. He simply existed, patiently and persistently, just outside the edges of my isolation. I didn't know it then, but he would become the person who would teach me how to heal. He would show me that love wasn't the enemy I had made it out to be. The fear of being vulnerable didn't come from nowhere. It was rooted in the story of my first heartbreak, a story I had tried to bury, but its echoes still haunted me. I met my first love when I was younger, more idealistic, and completely unguarded. Back then, love seemed simple, like a fairy tale where effort and commitment were enough to guarantee happiness. We built a life together, or so I thought. Every laugh, every plan for the future, every whispered promise felt like proof that we were unbreakable. But reality has a cruel way of dismantling illusions. Slowly, cracks began to show, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Arguments that once felt like passing storms became constant. Promises turned into apologies, and apologies turned into excuses. Trust, the foundation of everything we'd built, began to erode. The end came suddenly, like a door slamming shut. I discovered the truth in the most painful way, a betrayal that cut so deep it felt physical. Everything I thought I knew about love and trust was turned upside down. And the worst part? I blamed myself. I questioned every decision, every moment that led to that breaking point, as if I could have done something differently to stop it. I withdrew into myself, carrying the weight of that heartbreak like a secret burden. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the loss of belief in love itself. Love, I decided, was a dangerous gamble. I vowed never to put myself in that position again. That's why, when I met him, the man who would eventually help me heal, I was guarded. I didn't see him as a chance for connection. I saw him as a potential risk. But he wasn't deterred by my hesitation. He didn't push or demand, he just listened. Looking back, I realized that his patience was what started to chip away at the walls I had built. But it wasn't easy, and it didn't happen all at once. At the time, all I knew was that he saw me, not just the pieces I showed the world, but the broken parts I tried to hide. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I began to wonder, could I really let someone in again? That question lingered in my mind as our paths continued to cross. Though I didn't know it yet, his quiet persistence would become the catalyst for a journey I didn't think I had the strength to take. The journey to rediscover not just love, but myself. It began with small, almost forgettable moments. a kind smile when I was lost in my thoughts. A simple question that didn't demand much but lingered in my mind long after it was asked. At first I didn't think much of him. He seemed ordinary, a kind face in a sea of strangers. But sometimes it's the ordinary that has the power to shift everything. We met through a mutual interest, one of the few hobbies I had clung to after my heartbreak. It was in a quiet setting, where conversations flowed easily but without pressure. I wasn't looking for anything. Not a friend, certainly not love. But he had a way of speaking that felt genuine, as if every word carried weight. He didn't pry or try to fix me, something I was used to from well-meaning friends and acquaintances. Instead, he asked questions that made me reflect, questions that weren't about him, but about me. "What's your favourite memory?" he asked once, his tone light yet thoughtful. The simplicity of the question caught me off guard, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't have an answer ready. He seemed to notice my hesitation, but didn't push. Instead, he shared his own favourite memory, something small and sweet that spoke to the kind of person he was, someone who found joy in the little things. His willingness to be vulnerable, even in such a small way, planted a seed of curiosity in me. As we crossed paths more often, I found myself relaxing in his presence, almost against my will. He wasn't like the people I had distanced myself from, those who asked about my past out of curiosity or pity. He seemed content with the present, with whatever version of himself he was willing to show. There was one moment that stood out, though I didn't realize its importance until much later. We were sitting together after a casual gathering, the kind where people drift away in pairs or small groups. I had stayed behind out of habit, preferring the quiet after the noise. He stayed too, not saying much, but not leaving either. Finally, he broke the silence. "You seem like someone who's holding a lot inside," he said, his voice gentle but steady. The statement wasn't accusatory or intrusive. It was just true. For a moment I felt exposed, like he had seen straight through the walls I'd built so carefully. My instinct was to retreat, to pull away and guard myself, but something in his eyes stopped me. They weren't filled with judgment or pity, only understanding. "It's okay," he added quickly. "You don't have to talk about it. I just thought you should know I see you." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. "I see you." It was such a simple statement, but it held a depth I hadn't encountered in a long time. He didn't just see the version of me I presented to the world. He saw the cracks, the wounds I tried so hard to conceal. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to run. From that moment, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was subtle, like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. I wasn't ready to let him in completely, not yet. But for the first time, I began to wonder if healing was possible, if love could ever feel safe again. This realization didn't come without fear or hesitation, but it was a start. And with him, that felt like enough. For a long time, I had convinced myself that healing was a solitary process, that the only way to protect myself was to keep my walls intact. But as time passed, his quiet presence began to challenge that belief. He never rushed me or demanded more than I was willing to give. Instead, he showed me patience in a way I hadn't experienced before. It started with small gestures, things that seemed insignificant but carried a profound meaning. He remembered the little details I had let slip, like how I preferred my coffee or the way I always stopped to admire a sunset. When we talked, he listened, not just to my words, but to the spaces between them. One evening, during one of our increasingly frequent conversations, he asked, "What would make you happy right now?" The question startled me. Happiness had become an abstract concept, something I hadn't allowed myself to consider in a long time. I shrugged it off at first, but he didn't press. Instead, he shared his own answer. Something simple and honest, like spending a quiet day in nature or sharing a meal with someone he cared about. His response reminded me of something I had forgotten. Happiness didn't have to be monumental. It could be found in small, ordinary moments. That realization was a quiet turning point. Slowly, I began to open up, not in dramatic confessions, but in tiny pieces, letting him see parts of myself I had hidden for so long. There were moments when my fear tried to pull me back. I would question his motives, my own readiness, and whether I was capable of letting someone in again. But he never faltered. Whenever I hesitated, he gave me space. Whenever I doubted, he reassured me without smothering me. One night, as we sat talking under a canopy of stars, I told him something I hadn't shared with anyone. It wasn't a big secret, but it was a truth about my past that carried weight for me. He didn't react with surprise or pity, just understanding. "That must have been hard," he said softly. "But it doesn't define you." Those words echoed in my mind long after that night. It doesn't define you. For so long I had let my past dictate who I was and what I deserved. But with his support, I began to see that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about finding a way to live beyond it. I started to do things I had avoided for years. I reconnected with friends, pursued hobbies I had abandoned, and allowed myself to dream again. Each step felt uncertain, but with him by my side, I realized I wasn't walking alone. He never claimed to be my savior or tried to fix me. Instead, he showed me that I had the strength to heal myself. He was there to remind me that love wasn't something to be feared. It was something that could grow quietly, steadily, and beautifully when nurtured with trust and care. And as I took those first tentative steps toward healing, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, love was worth the risk after all. Just when I thought I was learning to trust again, the past found a way to resurface. Healing, as I discovered, is not a straight path. It's full of twists, turns, and unexpected setbacks. It happened on an ordinary day. I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, my ex. Seeing their name on my screen was like a jolt to the heart. All the progress I had made seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by the old familiar pain. They weren't apologizing or trying to reconcile. Instead, their words reopened wounds I thought had begun to heal. Suddenly, the walls I had started to dismantle felt necessary again. I didn't tell him about the message right away. I didn't want him to see how much it affected me. Part of me was ashamed that I wasn't stronger, that I was still haunted by someone who no longer held a place in my life. But he noticed something was wrong. He always noticed. Instead of prying, he gave me the space to figure out how I wanted to handle it. When I finally told him, I braced myself for his reaction, anger, pity, or worse, frustration. But he surprised me once again. He listened quietly as I explained what had happened. When I finished, he simply said, "You don't have to face this alone." Those words should have comforted me, but instead, they terrified me. The idea of letting him into that part of my life, of exposing the most painful corners of my heart, felt overwhelming. What if it was too much for him? What if he decided I wasn't worth the effort? For the first time since we'd met, I pushed him away. I told him I needed time, that I wasn't ready to talk about it anymore. He didn't argue or try to change my mind. He just nodded and said, "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." That night I lay awake replaying our conversation. His words echoed in my mind. "I'll be here." They were simple but powerful, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't as alone as I had convinced myself I needed to be. The next few days were a battle with myself. Part of me wanted to retreat, to shut him out completely and return to the safety of my solitude. But another part of me, the part that had started to believe in healing, in love, knew that pushing him away was a mistake. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't let my past dictate my future. The person who had hurt me didn't deserve that power anymore. And the person standing by my side, steady, patient and unwavering, deserved more than the fragments of my heart I was still clutching so tightly. So I reached out. I told him I wasn't ready to talk about everything yet, but that I wanted to try. His response was exactly what I had come to expect. No pressure, no demands, just support. "Whenever you're ready," he said. It wasn't a magical fix. There were still moments of doubt, still fears that tried to creep in. But for the first time I felt like I was facing those fears with someone instead of fighting them alone. And in that choice, to let him in, to let myself believe in love again, I realized that healing isn't about being fearless. It's about being brave enough to keep going, even when fear tries to hold you back. Deciding to let him in was one thing, but acting on that decision was something else entirely. Healing, I learned, isn't a single moment of clarity. It's a series of choices, some easier than others, and the biggest choice of all came on a night that began like any other. He invited me to an event, a small gathering with a few of his close friends. Normally I would have declined. Being around people, even people I knew wouldn't pry, felt like too much. But this time, I said yes. I wasn't sure why, but something inside me whispered that this was important. The night was filled with laughter and warmth, but I couldn't fully relax. As I watched him move through the room, so natural and at ease, I felt a pang of doubt. What was I doing here? Did I really belong in his world with someone so open and unguarded? He must have noticed the way my smile didn't quite reach my eyes, because he found me in a quiet corner and sat down beside me. "You okay?" he asked gently. I hesitated, the familiar urge to retreat rising like a tide. But this time I didn't run. Instead I took a deep breath and said, "I'm trying, but it's hard." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "I know," he said simply, "but you're doing it. And that's what matters." Before I could respond, one of his friends approached, pulling him into another conversation. I watched him go, feeling both relieved and oddly exposed. For the rest of the evening I stayed in that corner, quietly observing and grappling with the weight of my own emotions. As the night wound down, he walked me home. The silence between us was comfortable, but my mind was anything but. My doubts and fears swirled, louder than ever. Could I really trust him? Could I trust myself? When we reached my door, I turned to him, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'll ever be enough." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took my hand, his touch steady and warm. "You don't have to be anything but yourself," he said. "And if you're not ready, that's okay. But I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, something inside me broke, not in a painful way, but like a dam finally giving way to the rushing water behind it. The tears came unbidden, a flood of emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, and he didn't try to stop them. He just stayed, his presence grounding me in a way I couldn't explain. When the tears finally subsided, I felt lighter, as if some of the weight I had been carrying had finally been lifted. "Thank you," I whispered, the words barely audible. He smiled, not with triumph but with quiet understanding. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" I asked, my voice still shaky. "Don't give up on yourself no matter what." In that moment, I knew he wasn't just teaching me how to love again. He was teaching me how to love myself. It wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic declarations that changed me. It was his quiet, unwavering presence, his ability to see me when I couldn't see myself. That night, as I watched him walk away, I realized something important. Healing wasn't about erasing the pain of the past. It was about making space for something new. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to try. The days that followed felt different. Not perfect, not free from fear, but lighter, like I had finally set down a burden I'd carried for far too long. Letting myself feel vulnerable, letting someone see my fears and stay anyway, had shifted something deep within me. He didn't push me to change overnight. He never expected me to become someone I wasn't. Instead, he celebrated the small victories, the times I laughed without hesitation, the moments I reached for his hand first, the days I opened up about things I used to hide. Each step forward felt like a quiet triumph, a piece of myself I was reclaiming. One afternoon, as we walked through the park, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The person I had been before, closed off, afraid and burdened by the past, felt distant, like a shadow I could finally step out of. "I used to think I'd never feel this again," I said softly, more to myself than to him. He glanced at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and warmth. "Feel what?" I hesitated, but then I smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Hope." For a moment he didn't say anything, then he stopped walking and turned to face me. "You deserve that," he said simply. "You've always deserved it." His words stayed with me, not because they were dramatic or poetic, but because they felt true in a way I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. For so long, I had equated my past pain with my worth. But now, I was starting to see that my worth had never been tied to what I had endured. It was something that had always been there, waiting for me to recognize it. As the weeks turned into months, I began to embrace the idea that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to coexist with it, to let it be part of my story, without letting it define me. And more than that, it was about creating space for new chapters, chapters filled with love, trust, and the quiet, unshakable belief that I was worthy of both. He was by my side through it all, but not as a crutch or a savior. He didn't heal me. He showed me how to heal myself. He reminded me that love isn't about erasing scars. It's about accepting them as part of what makes us human. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset, he reached for my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt profound. "You've come so far," he said, his voice filled with pride. I squeezed his hand, my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible. "We've come so far," I corrected gently. Because while healing was a journey I had to take on my own, I had learned that it didn't have to be a lonely one. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Looking back, I realized that he didn't just teach me how to love again. He taught me how to believe in myself. And in doing so, he gave me the greatest gift of all, the courage to open my heart, not just to him, but to the world. Healing isn't a straight path, and it's rarely something we can achieve alone. My journey wasn't about someone swooping in to save me. It was about finding the courage to face my fears with someone by my side who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Your past doesn't define you. The pain, the heartbreak, the mistakes, they're part of your story, but they're not the whole story. Healing is about giving yourself permission to feel, to hope, and to take steps forward, even when it feels impossible. If you're watching this and you've ever felt broken, like you'll never trust again, I want you to know that it's okay to feel that way, but don't let it stop you from moving forward. Healing takes time, and it takes courage, but most of all, it takes faith. Faith that there's something better waiting for you if you're willing to open your heart. Take a moment now to reflect on your own journey. What's one small step you can take today toward healing? Maybe it's reaching out to a friend, writing down your feelings, or simply allowing yourself to dream again. Whatever it is, start small. Every step matters. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below with your own thoughts or experiences. Let's create a space where we can support in our journeys, no matter where we're starting from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love, resilience, and the human spirit. Together we can remind each other that even in our darkest moments, hope is never far. Because if I've learned anything, it's that love, real, true, and healing love, is always worth the risk.